Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. I'm Jenny Yu. I'm the Industry Practice Leader for Chemicals and Life Sciences at Marsh, UK and Ireland, and I will be hosting this webinar today. We have a great panel today. Caroline Rivet, Digital Security and Privacy Lead for Life Sciences at KPMG. Brian Warsoner, UK Cyber Growth Leader at Marsh. Jano Bermudez, Head of Cyber Risk Consulting at Marsh. The webinar is scheduled to last 45 minutes, and there will be a Q&A discussion with the panelists. I would like to encourage you to submit any questions you have throughout the webinar. You can submit your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your computer screen. If a question is not answered during today's webinar, someone from Marsh will respond as soon as possible. Let's start. As it is well published, in June 2017, Merck reported that its computer systems were affected by the NotPetya ransomware attack. Their production was affected for over a year. According to a publication on the 13th of July 2020 by the insurer, Munich has joined Allianz and two other carriers in settling a legal dispute with Merck relating to losses from the attack that led to a claim for more than $1.3 billion on its property policy. In the last few months, we have also seen cyber attacks on healthcare and medical research organizations. It seems that the life science industry is specifically targeted. So why is that? What assets are they looking for, and what methods do they use to attack? And how has COVID-19 affected the cyber risk landscape for life science companies? Brian, would you like to take this question first?
Sure, thank you, Jenny. And it's interesting to see how the shift in the actual risk landscape, which will kind of help us answer this question. So the assets previously were the primary targets from the intellectual property of life science organizations, or what we might call the secret sauce, the chemical recipes for the drugs being produced. But now we're seeing it more as a pure destruction. What's really caused this is we saw that the US Congress and the big pharma going head to head in pricing drugs being produced. It's creating a lot of bad reputation for pharmaceutical companies. So in turn, the cyber criminal underworld is actually taking action upon themselves to target the particular life sciences in a lot of cases. So when we start looking at the targets, what are they using? A lot of denial of services or direct denial of services, or DDoS, if you've heard that before. But more commonly, we're actually seeing ransomware as a way to utilize the human vulnerabilities to deploy that type of malware. So while ransomware demands are going up, it's not the primary objective of this malware to actually gain the monetary value, but rather they're trying to disrupt or create this business interruption as the main goal for these individuals and groups, from my point of view at least.
Thank you, Brian. Anna, would you like to add?
Yeah, I think just going back to your initial comment about the who is really interesting in relation to life sciences. So, as per Brian's comment, the kind of traditional rich stores of personal data makes it a great target for traditional criminal activity. But also, if you look at the new, so the kind of the new situation we're in as a result of COVID-19, you see this targeted attacks around gaining access to research or pre-patented drugs as one of the common things. So you're really thinking about nation-state type attackers, so really advanced cyber attackers, and then the ongoing debate around healthcare as a universal right, and some of the discussions that it brings. Also brings to light a different actor, so more what we call a hacktivist, so activists or hackers with idealistic goals. So really is a complex complex environment in terms of the attackers who are interested in compromising organizations in the life science industry.
And just to add to this, pharmaceutical companies, life sciences organizations are by nature very, very complex, and they have long and complex value chains reaching into numbers of different organizations. If we dwell upon the who and the why, of course with COVID, you've got huge worldwide emphasis and scrutiny going on in terms of the pharmaceutical companies. We had a press release we had from the NCSC in the UK a couple of weeks back, which was highlighting cyber attacks going on specific pharmaceutical companies, targeting them for COVID responses, for COVID vaccines, intellectual property, mechanisms of manufacture, and that was Cozy Bear APT 29, which was specifically highlighted there. So really sophisticated nation state attacks going on these pharmaceutical companies who are formulating vaccines and mechanisms to help us come out of lockdown, to help us get back to economic normality again. So that first of all, but secondly, as we've talked about, pharmaceutical companies, probably due to their very complexity, they're not immune from the general ransomware attacks, which are at large. And we opened up with the discussion on Merck there. So different reasons. And I think thirdly, the other thing we should also bear in mind are insider threats, insider risks with potentially disgruntled or upset employees. And we're seeing that is starting to come through and come to the attention of a number of pharmaceutical companies. So back to you, Jenny.
Thank you. That's very insightful. So it seems that the life science industry is facing increased cyber risk. So how does it compare to other industries in terms of cyber security? And what are the key security gaps you have seen in the systems of life science companies? Jano, would you like to start?
Sure. So I think, you know, as with any industry the size of the life sciences industry, it varies widely. You know, with the majors, with the major pharmaceutical companies and organizations in that space we're seeing significant investment in that space. So pretty much on par with the investment banks in the oil and gas industry, where over the last 10 or so years, you've seen significant investment and a significant step up in the ability to defend itself purely because of the number of attacks and the targeting of that industry. But that isn't universal. So for the other aspect, where, you know, for the smaller companies, they're still struggling. We're seeing a lot of real impact in the small and medium-sized companies with ransomware, as we kind of discussed, where organizations, you know, even from an existential and resilience point of view, being impacted. And then the other thing I'd like to mention in this space as well that is driving up the risk for life sciences is the high level of M&A activity. So that needs to be considered. So where organizations are changing hands, or where there's amalgamation of organizations in a specific industry, and some good examples are in the data and research side and the pharmacies side as well, where you're seeing kind of amalgamation of small independent pharmacies to larger conglomerates. There you're kind of, you know, you're basically, we see organizations taking on a level of what we refer to as technical debt, you know, not really understanding the state of the organization before it's bought and integrated, and then that integration can be much more significant than previously expected. So I think those are the 3 points I'd make. I'll pass back to you, Jenny, to see if any of our others have additional comments.
If I could maybe just add some things here, building on which Jano said. Again, we come back to the fact that you've got a very, very complex value chain within life sciences. There are very few industries where you move all the way from research into development, manufacturing, and then into commercial. Very few industries which reach into as many third and fourth parties. So it's very complex. That's the first point. Second point I'd make is that the investment into security in life sciences has been comparatively late compared to other industries such as, for example, oil and gas. The third aspect is that because of this complexity and because you're dealing with manufacturing and so on, manufacturing systems have been built to last, which means that there could well be very old systems in there, very old security in there. Often in many life sciences companies, their security in manufacturing is probably not as good as other parts of their business, let me put it like that. And they are investing very, very heavily in their manufacturing system security, in their laboratory system security. And then fourthly, really key point, we are seeing a huge amount of change in life sciences and healthcare with digital, and that change is only going to increase. And there is a lot of value in genomic data, in location data, medical data, linking them all together so then you get a personalized medicine response for people. And we're introducing then digital into the equation, and there is going to be insecurity with how that is being set up. So very complex, lot of change, and lack of investment in the past.
Yeah, I think just to step in once again, if I can, I think you raise a really interesting point, is the complexity of the entire industry. So at the one end of it, you've got this industry bleeding edge, you know, with commercial devices and healthcare devices like IoT and wearables being kind of developed, and the life cycle of those is rapidly changing, and therefore the vulnerabilities of those is rapidly changing. So new vulnerabilities coming in all the time, new exploits coming in all the time. And then the tail end of that, the manufacturing end of that, where, you know, this investment in the manufacturing infrastructure, R&D infrastructure is not trivial, and therefore it's designed for a much longer lifespan. So it's not the typical 3 to 5 years that you get with common IT, but more 10 to 15 to 20 years. And so at the tail end of that life cycle, you really are dealing with obsolescence as a key issue. So how do you deal with that obsolescence? You know, you don't have the luxury of securing it by design, so what can you do about that? So I think that kind of extreme on the one end to the other end is the challenge that life sciences has to deal with.
Thank you, Jenna. So just to add to the complication, as we all know, there's one topic which is absolutely crucial to this industry, that is regulation, as there are various regulations, guidelines throughout a medical product's life cycle. So what are the key cyber regulations relevant to life science companies? Caroline, would you like to address this question, please?
Yes, of course, I'll start. So again, this is very, very complex, and there are different parts of regulations relating through the life sciences value chain. But let's first of all start with the patient. And there you've got regulations. So the key one are the privacy regulations. You've got GDPR in the EU, and in the US, you've got CCPA. You've got new regulations coming in terms of South Africa. So there you've got privacy regulations about how you treat people's data and treating it with respect. And part of that will relate to security for privacy and how you look after that specific data. So you've got I suppose the privacy regulations. Then if you look at manufacturing, if you look at distribution, if you look at research, you've got the kind of GXP type regulations. Now those regulations, good manufacturing practice, good research practice, good distribution practice, all of those, they've been they've been in place for decades, and their focus is not on security, but they will have aspects which have a security impact. And so they haven't been designed for security, but they do help secure the systems and the enterprise. What we're also increasingly seeing is very specific security type regulations. And there we've got regulations relating to medical devices. And there we've got the EU's medical device directive, which also has regulations specifically relating to security within it. And then if we also think about some of the safety impacts, we've got regulators like the FDA, the MHRA, the EMA in Europe. They're increasingly looking at the safety impact of security, and they're looking at how organizations are actually securing the production of medicines, and they're starting to introduce regulations around that. And you know, anecdotally, I've had discussions with numbers of my clients where they've talked about that if they do not improve the security of their production facilities or of their research facilities, then the regulators will come in more fiercely with them. So that's driving a lot of the investment in the manufacturing facilities. So numbers of different regulations here, nothing that specifically says this is about security for life sciences. It really depends upon which type of life sciences you're actually looking at. One of the things I haven't covered here is NIS. NIS looks at specific critical industries. Life sciences at the moment is not listed within that. We may well see a change going forward in terms of production of vaccines, given the criticality of those of that for our economies, for our people, and for our societies going forward. Jana, Brian, you might want to add to some of the things I've just been saying.
No, I agree there. I'm glad you made the comment on the NIS directive. I think, to me, the obvious question after you kind of just articulated the entire kind of regulatory landscape is, you know, how do I get my hands around all of this stuff when I'm thinking about it? And that's the challenge we're seeing with our clients. One of the things I will say is, and that's why it's important that you mentioned NIS, is that more and more we're seeing specialist regulators and specialist sectors not trying to reinvent the wheel, but actually backing off onto the industry best practices. So you'll see the FDA making comments that almost directly are translatable into the NIST framework in the US as an example. And we expect to see similar regulators in specialist industries across the European Union and other areas to pretty much back onto what becomes the best of breed, whether it's BSI or whether it's the NIS directive. So I think that's the key. Is there is a emerging best practice that's encapsulated in a number of different standards, and those typically are adopted by the specialist industries. The other thing is that you're seeing this integration formally in the EU of safety-related industries and cyber-related. So that there's a conjoining of that, which is great because you're not seeing disharmony. I think that the comment, the view that came to my head when you went through that, Caroline, was the disharmony of all of these. You know, where are the overlaps and underlaps? And I think what you're seeing more and more is that there's an integration of all of this stuff. So good security practice is good security practice, and then working out how to demonstrate compliance is a secondary activity that is obviously critically important as well.
Yes, and just to add to that, with my clients, I'm just working with one of them around the NIST framework and doing evaluations on that, and that's been helpful. It doesn't go into some of the deep technicalities, but that's what it is. But also, I suppose if we think about what is security, well, it's about confidentiality, yes. That's important here in terms of confidentiality of patient information. It's all about availability of systems and data. And yes, you can see that in production of medicines and also in laboratories as well. But it's also, I think, most importantly about integrity and integrity of data and information. And we especially see that in research, but also in manufacturing as well. But increasingly we'll see it with increased use of Internet of Things, use of devices, and this integration between life sciences and healthcare, and that meshing together of patient data, genomic data, location data, to improve healthcare, to improve medicines. So I think the integrity aspect is going to be the absolute key part here of security.
Thank you. That was very interesting. So before we move on to the next slide, can we have our first poll, please, Rob? So what, in your opinion, is the likelihood that your cybersecurity might be breached at your organization in the next 5 years? 1 is very unlikely, 5 is very likely. Your answer is completely anonymous. Right, we have our result here. We have 44% likely and 22% very likely. Very interesting, very interesting. This is actually close to a survey which was done by the UK government. It's updated in March 2020, so not including the period, this period, the lockdown period. So in that survey, it shows almost half of the business report having cybersecurity breaches or attacks in the previous 12 months. So I will not be surprised if the percentage will be close to 100% if the survey were to be conducted in 5 years' time with a reporting period of 5 years. So it just shows we still have a big gap between the perceived risk and the actual risk here. Thank you. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. We'll talk about risk mitigation. I think by now we have to acknowledge that cyber attack is not if, but when. Cyber risk cannot be eliminated, but it can be mitigated and managed. So what should a company do to mitigate the increased risk and measure their exposures? Jenna, would you like to start?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think just going back to the poll, as you know, Jenny, I wanted to bring that down to 1 year, because I think most companies will experience some kind of a disruption, breach, or some kind of inadvertent attack, in the next 12 months is my view. The question I would have is whether they'd be able to detect it and really understand that it's happened. It could have been an insider, could be a very advanced attacker. But what do companies do about this? So what I thought I would do is start with just reading out what advice the FDA give, because I think it's a good statement, and it goes back to the comment I made about specialist industries really adopting the best practices that are already encapsulated in some advanced standards and approaches. But what they say is, so have a system for monitoring and detecting cybersecurity vulnerabilities and invest to stay current. So a lot of organizations we find, having spent quite a lot of time in industry, doing forensic investigations, often don't know that they've been attacked until several complicated attacks have taken place. So they're often reporting something 3, 4, 6 months, even several years after, in some occasions, the initial attacks have happened. So being able to detect it quickly is critical, and investing in that security to stay current, because attackers don't, they don't have one way of attacking. They continue to evolve because it's people behind it. So as Jenny said, you can't eradicate cyber risk. So use risk management to identify and understand the level of risk and vulnerability that you're exposed to continually reevaluate. And then this is one that's probably a little bit uncomfortable for an industry that's so competitive, is include external cybersecurity stakeholders in your security posture. So this is discussed as a kind of formally known as coordinated vulnerability disclosure. So one of the things that we saw in terms of borrowing from another industry, in the oil and gas industry, who again were very, very competitive, is that they realized that there was no value in not sharing information about cyber breaches and learnings. And so they created an inter-industry organization that would share in real time events that were happening, so that they could thwart industry targeted criminals. So to prevent attacks, knowing that if an attack was happening on one of our competitors, those attackers are likely to reuse that same technology on us and try to attack us. So that's a bit uncomfortable. And then lastly, mitigate risk proactively before they're exploited. So don't wait and sit on things. And then the hardest part is probably taking, considering security by design as you're developing products. And also considering the life cycle that you're going to have to manage those products through. So that's probably the most challenging piece. So if you, I know there's a diagram on this, if you go to this, so this is a little bit how we like to think about it, so to try to demystify what cyber is. I mean, from a Marsh perspective, we always start with the impacts on the right-hand side. So what are the worst things that could happen? And the reason we start there is because we're often involved in managing claims. So what is the worst thing that can happen? Well, we could have a lot of costs around response, around liability for third parties and first parties, business interruption, etc., legal fees, and a range of other impacts. What we tried to do is take that all the way back to, where do they come from? So what are the sources of those? So, who are the actors? And we talked about nation states, we talked about criminals, and we talked about hacktivists. Each one of those actors has a very particular approach to attacking things, a very particular skill set and set of resources available to them, and they will approach attacks in different ways. So there's a very different attack type for a criminal who has a lot of resources at his disposal, and a hacktivist who may not have all of those resources, but actually might be highly motivated. So the way that things happen is very different. We then look at the life cycle of an attack, and that's what this diagram kind of tries to articulate. Is first there has to be an attacker, there has to be some kind of vulnerability which leads to a cause, there's an event, and contrary to a lot of discussions, the cyber response doesn't stop at the event. An event that doesn't necessarily mean it leads to a significant downstream impact. So how we respond to that event is critical in the in kind of the end result. Did we manage it carefully, and kind of did we quickly detect it, contain it, and eradicate that actor, or did they get into the system, manage to step into something highly vulnerable, kick off a ransomware, and suddenly we've had to pay massive ransoms, but we've had our systems disrupted for periods of time, significant periods of time. And so if you look at the bottom, prepare, prevent, detect, respond, recover, that is actually the NIST framework. So that is one of probably the leading frameworks for security. So the reason why I bring it up as an example is that in modern frameworks, we're overlaying controls that prevent or reduce the impact of a cyber event over the life cycle of how attackers attack. And the reason why this is important for life sciences in particular is the conversation that we had around obsolescence at the one end of the spectrum, and the bleeding edge of kind of IoT and all of the innovation that's happening at the other end of the spectrum. So to give you two converse examples, so for the IoT and the bleeding edge, you really are dealing with the preventative side of things. So embed in the design. So if you're adopt R&D around a product, really look at security characteristics and requirements around that product. Try to embed security by design. And that's at the other end of the spectrum of the manufacturing side of things, where you have an asset that is maybe 10 years into its 15 to 25 year life cycle, and a lot of the security controls that preventative controls are already predated, so you don't have the option of prevent. So what can you do? Well, what we are helping organizations to do is think about deploying advanced detection, so that if something does happen, that you can actually respond to it, you know that it's happening. You may not be able to prevent it, but you know that it's happening. If there is a business interruption event as a result of that, so a ransomware event, that you have tested your recovery. So you're able to recover within the requirements set. So that requirement might be GDPR, so that, data, the availability of data, critical healthcare data at the right time, at the right place. So even if you lost the system, the ability to recover that data would avoid a breach of the GDPR, or other contractual requirements that you might have with hospitals, etc., or critical industries. The ability to respond and recover. So how you overlay your controls over the life cycle of an attack makes a huge difference in terms of the threat you're trying to prevent, but also best bang for buck. So, what we've seen in a lot of organizations, they spend a lot of money on security, build their walls all very high, but actually, there are cracks in between the walls. So really understanding the risks that you're dealing with and deploying your controls and your investment sensibly. Understanding it. So you can't just simply think that, well, we'll do cyber essentials and we should be okay. You really need to think about your particular organizational exposure. Are you a bleeding edge organization, or are you at the tail end and you're protecting a manufacturing asset? And how you develop your strategy will vary widely. So I'll kind of pause there. There's a lot there, and I'm sure Caroline and Brian have bits that they want to wade in on.
Yeah, I think just, on that, just from an insurance perspective, hitting on one particular key part of this is the question of understand your exposure. So answering that question is not always easy. So I try to simplify it, and Caroline alluded to this a little bit, the confidentiality, integrity, or availability, or what we call the CIA triad. A lot of organizations, we could break this down into data privacy or business interruption, the integrity being the one part of that doesn't get to as simplify as much as we can with the other two. But a lot of organizations in different industry sectors have one, maybe two of these three from the CIA triad. The life science organizations, and Caroline mentioned this too, is they dabble into all of these areas. So we're not talking about just the confidentiality from IP side of things, from the B2B side. We also have potential research depending on where the patient anonymized data is coming from and where that key lies. The last part, and is probably the biggest thing in my point of view, is the production side. It's where the income starts to come out because of the production after a phase 4, when we get through all the other parts that may be on the privacy side. So we can go into multiple different directions of where is data stored, how is it stored, how many places is it stored, when is it stored or removed. From the interruption side, we can look at the critical time that you need to be up and running when a product has been cleared to go into mass production. How much of the storage of that product you have in case you do go down. I know in some cases we've seen up to 60 days. And then also, how can you sustain a network interruption? What's the longest that you could be down, where we start getting into degradation of income from the actual degradation of the systems, or even getting into the non-critical systems? How long does it go? So we try to map this out into multiple different buckets. What Jan was showing on here on this is, as you mentioned, the NIST. You could break it down for from the insurance side. When we start buying insurance, is that data and that business interruption, and what are we trying to prevent or actually cover in some cases from the risk transfer, gets into those impacts, which you see on the screen, is the third-party liability from the potential lawsuits or the business interruption. And then we have all these other different types of first-party losses that may fall into that. But it's at least knowing that your exposure is at a high level from that CIA triad that will really help you understand how to mitigate the risk itself.
And also just, I suppose, to, from my perspective, I think privacy and the GDPR and the potential fines there, which we've seen starting to come through, such as with British Airways for breaches there. And so to think about where you are holding confidential, personal patient data. And I would say that with the increasing exploration of digital and increase in use of patient data, that there are going to be risks there. And life science, what I'm seeing with the numbers of life sciences companies is you've got this balance between innovation, people within research, people within clinical trials and clinical developments, looking at how they can use patient data of different sorts and not necessarily always following the correct procedures. There could be problems there down the line, especially with some of the large fines which are being issued.
Thank you. So Brian just mentioned insurance just now. So before we move on to our final slide on risk transfer, we have another poll, please. What level of engagement is between your cybersecurity function and your insurance function in respect of cyber risks? From 1 to 5, 1 is none, 5 is significant. If you don't know, you can skip this question. Okay, we have got the result. That's very interesting, but not surprising. We often see a disconnect between the cybersecurity function and the insurance function. Needless to say, risk transfer will be most effective and cost efficient if there is a more joined up approach between these two functions. Okay, thank you, Rob. Let's move on. So we talked about risk mitigation, but for the residual risk after risk mitigation, insurance can be an effective and cost-efficient tool to transfer your risk. What is the view of the current market regarding capacity, cover, pricing, and limits for the life science organizations? Brian, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, I feel like I might be the best one on this one to start off. But in terms of what the market's doing right now is really a direct correlation to what's going on in the economy. And this wouldn't be just in the cyberspace. I know many of you that are listening to this and watching this are getting impacted in multiple different lines. But what we've seen really is the economy affecting insurers from the top down. But when we start getting into cyber, we're seeing the claims from the ground up start to have an impact. So in some cases, certain industries are feeling it from both sides, but we're not into any kind of like true hard market. For life sciences, we're seeing actually more interest in life sciences because of the regulatory oversight, which causes a lot more security to be put in place. But we are seeing some significant claims that are changing that. From a capacity side, yeah, the marketplace is not, you may hear reductions in some carriers trying to offer less than 20 and they're going down to 10s, but overall, we're still seeing 500 million plus in capacity for single insureds being put out. So it's no change there. It's a shift again. From the improvements of the business interruption coverage side of things, that's where I think the most impactful it is for the life science industry sector. When we look at all the things we talked about earlier from Jano, Caroline, and myself, we talked about making sure that your operations can stay up and running. Jano has mentioned IoT several times. The Internet of Things is becoming more prevalent as we have to work from home as well. So when it starts going down due to a ransomware or a network interruption or a third party that you rely upon, that is something that is significant in terms of being covered underneath the policy. So that's something that's actually being put into place. We're not seeing any change or any degradation in the actual coverage being offered there. But taking it one step further and going outside the virtual world, we're seeing property damage actually being covered. This is generally an interest that has always been in the life science, from my experience in cyber insurance, is that we start looking at how our products are being actually transferred to and from, whether it be overseas or on the ground within a landmass. But when we have to look at the refrigeration or the different types of storage temperatures, how that's all controlled. Previously, it was in the container. Now we're starting to see it shift into a remote control computer that you can actually change the temperature from thousands of miles away down to actually tracking where that particular product is to update what the deliverable might be for your customers. So when we start looking at all of this being put together, yes, the claims are going up in frequency and severity, and it's creating some of the higher premiums, but I think the coverage that's coming out of it is much more important than when we start looking at the premiums that are being charged in that particular area. So understanding your controls and exposures, as we talked about in the previous page, has made such a huge difference in both the coverage, but also with the premiums, and becoming a little bit closer with your actual underwriters and the insurers. You know, the polling question talked about how close are you with your IT, but if you're looking at, or if anyone has an actual cyber insurance policy, you know, being closer to your insurers and being more transparent does help out in the overall like process of getting more capacity, more coverage, better price, and additional limits for different types of coverage that would be put in place.
So you have alluded to in terms of purchasing cyber policy and what companies should be aware of. So can you expand on that, and what are other things a company should be aware of when purchasing a cyber policy?
Yeah, I think firstly, cyber policies are a safety net. This is not, you know, what Jano may do from the consulting side or what Caroline may do from her position at KPMG. All IT specialists are trying to work 24/7 to stop the millions of attacks that are coming in. But 99.9% of these attacks are just testers, feelers, people trying to get into your different networks in different ways. And it may be en masse sending it to multiple different emails. There are sophisticated targeted attacks that are happening. We talked about that in the beginning in the first question. But it's nearly impossible to stop every single attack, and something will get through. And that's where this comes into play from being a safety net side of things. The communication and the continual interaction with IT, I know we talked about this earlier, is increasingly important to understand that this is that safety net. We're not challenging the IT to say, you're not doing your job. If you have millions of attacks in some cases a day, how are you able to prevent all of that? You can't, but you have to prevent or protect your financial balance sheet. So that's where this comes into play. The second part, when you're starting to look at the actual policy, or even if you're going through a renewal side of things, is understand the exclusions, particularly in the life science industry sector. When you start going into what's covered, what's not, intellectual property, product liability, all these different things start to come into play. Yes, exclusions change as much as we expand coverage. And not to get into too much detail, but we all heard about the war exclusion in cyber, or most of us have. There are some changes that are coming down the road with the particular war exclusion through Lloyd's in this case. But if you have this constant conversation, or if you're not having this conversation with your broker, if you have a policy on an annual and sometimes biannual basis, you know, it's not going the right way. You need to have that conversation with exclusions. But then I think lastly too, just looking at how we want to pursue this coverage going forward, and I may get in trouble with my team in the UK on this, but push the limits. The one thing when you start looking at a policy is ask if we can cover this. There's no reason to stop you from saying, can we cover mad mal? Can we cover property damage? Can we cover intellectual property? Push the limits, see what you can do, but also understand some of these things may be new ideas to the cyber specific side of purchasing risk transfer. But I would say go to your broker and come up with all the things that you're concerned about. And it's the first conversation that all of our brokers should have with any of our clients is, what are your concerns? What is going to impact you the most? Getting to the exposure, talking to people like Jano and Caroline to understand those different exposures. And then the next question is, what can we do about it? So don't go for that off the shelf side of policy. It doesn't fit every organization or life science in particular because of all the different unique risks that you have in your industry.
Thank you. Do you also have some cyber claims examples for the industry? Or just to share what worked, what didn't, and any learning?
Yeah, I think just in the interest of time, I'll go into just the one claim that we had, if we can bring that up, is this is an example of a ransomware that happened a couple of years ago, and you can see that from the dates, but it really gives you an idea of where all these costs could impact your organization. And this is a life science from 2018, a US headquartered life science, but for the protection of their confidentiality, we're not going to name the particular industry or the particular organization. But when you look at what the actual losses are coming from, net income loss, we talked about that, but also the hardware side. Now, when we start getting into property damage, we talked about it. There's this middle ground where replacing servers or replacing PCs is becoming a thing. If we know about the large shipping company that had to replace all of their computers, which was over 400,000 computers having to be replaced. That is a significant cost, and you could see that on here. And then the last bit is more the personnel related extra expenses. And this is one interesting case, not to get too much back into the insurance side, but from the claim side, that overtime in a US policy was actually not covered. In London, that is actually covered. So in this year, they actually transferred their policy over, and that is an additional coverage they would get to cover that 6.3 million loss in increased work or overtime as it's listed here. You could see that there's these different costs that add up to a significant amount when it comes down to that 31.2 million loss in their case. I know that this is an ongoing particular investigation in terms of qualifying some of the costs, but they already have 10 million of that covered.
Thank you. So that concludes our panel discussion today. Can we have our final poll, please? What topics would you like to see in our future webinars? Please select all that apply. If there are any other topics you are interested but not in the list, please submit via the Q&A function at the bottom of your computer screen. That's great. Thank you. Thank you for the feedback. We'll arrange future webinars accordingly. So we have run into our time limit today. For the questions we have not been able to address today, we will get back to you after webinar. Thank you for joining us today. It has been our pleasure to host you. A big thanks goes to our panelists as well. We'll be sending out a copy of today's presentation to all those that registered and attended. Please do not hesitate to reach out to your Marsh representative for any questions you may have. For more information and resources to aid in your response to the current outbreak, we encourage you to visit our COVID-19 resource hub on marsh.com/UK. Here you will find our current thought leadership offerings, solutions, and advice. Thank you again, take care, and stay safe.